Some of you may remember that in 2018, we had a conference which was called How Israel is Portrayed in the Media. And one of our speakers was James Marlow. James lives in London, and he's been a journalist for many years. He's worked for many different outlets, and he'll tell us a little bit about that. His speciality, you might believe, is Israel. And when it comes to Israel, he spends a lot of time, poor guy, following elections. And if you know what elections in Israel is like, you will be you feel very sorry for James. But for tonight, he's going to be very welcome because he's a specialist in the subject. And we're only 5 days away from the next election, next Tuesday. And we felt this would be a great opportunity to help people understand a little bit more about the elections. And we are thinking also, if there's enough demand, to have another session with James after the elections are completed, and there is some idea of what the results might look like, and maybe James can then analyze that for us. But to start with, James, what I'd like you to do, there's quite a lot of people on now, and what I'd like you to do is just spend a little bit of time telling everyone about yourself, who you are, what you are, where you come from, what you do, and then we'll maybe move on, and you can tell us after that a little bit about your life as a journalist, if that's okay.
Okay, a very good evening to you, and thank you for joining us this evening, Glasgow Friends of Israel. And it's true, I have been in Glasgow twice before, once for a few hours to play the drums for a very, very well-known Jewish singer by the name of Shlomo Carlebach, and the second one was overnight stay. Actually, it was two nights overstay for the Glasgow Friends of Israel in 2018. So thank you for that reminder. I have to get back to Glasgow and indeed Scotland one day to see some of the beauty across the country, but that might be some way away, but we shall see. If I may just correct you on one of the things that you said in the introduction over there. So I am in Israel. I'm actually in London right now, despite the fact of the background behind me. As you could probably tell, the sun has gone down behind me in the Western Wall. So this is just a picture, as I'm sure you spotted, but I'm an Israeli citizen as well as a British citizen. I do vote in Israel. I have voted several times before. Of course, I'm not going to explain to you how I vote, because one of the wonderful things about a democracy is that we have a secret ballot. But I will certainly be happy to talk to you about the PR system and the voting system. And interestingly enough, over the last few days, a number of Zoom talks I have given, believe it or not, a number of Israelis, some who have voted before, some who are olim, new immigrants, never voted before, but some of them have, and yet they are still so confused when they go into the ballot booths and the ballot boxes and exactly how, because it's not like you do in the United Kingdom, whereby that you have a bit of paper, you take a pen or a pencil, you put a cross next to your favorite candidate or your favorite party, and then you put it in the box. It doesn't work like that at all in Israel, and it confuses so many people. The amount of questions I've had in the last few days is quite extraordinary. But just to confirm, I am in London. I was supposed to be flying to Israel today, but due to some complications and the fact that I've only had one vaccine as opposed to 2 vaccines, there's lots of paperwork to fill in, and I'm hoping to get there before the election, but we'll have to see. And also the other thing as well is in Israel is that you have to not just be an Israeli citizen, but in order to vote, you have to actually be living in Israel with a full-time address, and in some cases, paying the local taxes, which is called arnona. So in other words, it's not good enough if you're an Israeli citizen, but you now live in America or in Europe or in the United Kingdom, and you just have to be there on election day. You've lost that right to vote. You have to be physically living in Israel and working and paying local taxes, etc. So it's very different from, and there's no such thing as postal votes. There's no such thing as proxy votes. So briefly on my background, I'm Jewish. I'm in my 50s. Wow. I have worked in the countries of the United States, in Israel, the United Kingdom, lived and worked in the US, in Israel, in the United Kingdom, France, Malta, and Switzerland. That's 6 countries. I think there's one other, but I've forgotten. And I've managed to travel quite a lot across Europe and worked and spoken over there many times, mostly connected with my work as a broadcaster, as a journalist, or in some form of communication in one form or another. I went to Jewish schools. And what else do you want to know about my background, Sammy?
Well, I think that's pretty good. What I'd like to know a little bit about is the different papers and media you've worked for, and why you worked for them, and what kind of speciality, if any, you had with them.
Okay, well, I can tell you how I'm slightly different when it comes to journalism. So I'm not a real journalist. I don't want to use the word false journalist or fake journalist, but I'm not a real one. I'm somebody who came from the broadcasting field. I was actually a disc jockey on the radio in the 1980s, which is quite extraordinary. And one of the reasons why I moved out to the United States, in particular Los Angeles, was to be on the radio in Los Angeles. And I was the host of the UK Top 30 Countdown across America, plus a few stations in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. It was very exciting. That was back in the late 80s and early 90s. And I didn't have any real interest in news whatsoever. So I don't come from the journalism school or the university. I don't have the degrees. I don't have all the bump that one presumably should have as a journalist. I fell into it literally by accident. When I was in Los Angeles, I was somebody who got a telephone call from a very well-known radio station at the time in London called Capital Radio. And they said, James, you're out there. Can you do some broadcast on the Grammys, which is a yearly music award ceremony, and of course the Oscars. And then there was some mudslides. So we spoke about that. There was brush fires. The brush fires is fires just break out in the valleys and they start to fall down on houses. This past year, last summer, was exceptionally bad. And then, of course, the very famous Los Angeles riots in May 1992, where I was on the phone as a journalist, as a correspondent, reporting on some of the worst violence that I've ever experienced. And I've been in many countries across the Middle East. And that was pretty scary in those days. So I found myself just doing bits of news. When I lost my visa in the United States, I expected to go off to Israel. However, I stopped off in London and I got a call from a talk news radio station to say, would I come in and do some reports and some correspondent work? And then they gave me a show, which was actually centered around Israel and the Middle East. It was a Jewish show on the radio station called Spectrum that got its license as an ethnic minority. So the Jewish show had a daily show between 10 and 12, 6 days a week, 6 days being Sunday to Friday, not of course on the Saturday, on the Shabbat. And I was there for I think a year before I moved on to LBC radio. So as you can see, I literally made that change as being a disc jockey on the radio into news. I did a bit of work with CNN and INTN radio. I was in the INTN building in London. I moved off to Israel as a correspondent for INTN and their radio section at the time, which I forget the name of it. And I was a correspondent for Al Jazeera in Israel. I was actually their official Israel political analyst around 2003 and 2004 and 2005. Al Jazeera, yeah, they were quite pro-Israel at the time, believe it or not. It's just in the last 12 years that Al Jazeera had a lot more money pumped into it from a country called Qatar. And it was being pumped into on the basis that it would be an anti-Israel network. So their policy has very much changed since then. The BBC used to call me when I was in Israel, and Channel 4 called me, which is part of the INTN network. Basically, your name is on the list. And I, again, started to do these reports. Circumstances just brought me back to the United Kingdom about 10 years ago, but I've traveled 2 or 3 times to Israel every single year since then. And I do reports for Sky News and LBC and 1 or 2 other networks. I am a writer previously for the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, It's obviously been JC, the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish News. And for the last 4 years, there is another Jewish paper. You don't get it in Glasgow, and you don't get it in anywhere else now except Manchester or London. But it has 15,000 copies per week. It's called the Jewish Weekly, and it is the largest newspaper outside of Israel in terms of its focus on the Israeli election. So in other words, all the different parties, the candidates, the lists, the analysis, the poll tables, news briefs, that's all compiled by myself. And it actually has been received very, very well. No other newspaper, Jewish or non-Jewish, outside of Israel has such a big election pullout every single week. It's called the Jewish Weekly, and I post some of those things on the Times of Israel, because I've got a blog on the paper called the Times of Israel. So you can just Google my name, James Marlow, / Times of Israel, and all the blogs should come up. And a lot of election news is on there if you want to find out the latest.
Right,
Sammy.
that's great. That's great, James. You should be able to answer every single question that anybody asks tonight then. So I'd like to start off with the fact that we're about to approach fourth election. Now, most people will know that it's the fourth election, but not everyone will know why we are approaching yet another election in under 2 years. I think it's the only country in the world that is having a fourth election in under 2 years. I think I Googled it and I couldn't find any other country doing it. So I came to the conclusion Israel must be a banana republic. But you might come up with a better reason why there's a fourth election in under 2 years.
Well, Israel is definitely not a banana republic, a country that has led the world in the COVID vaccination process. When you have prime ministers like Boris Johnson on the phone to the Prime Minister of Israel regularly and explain to him how it's worked so well in Israel. This is what you should be doing, Mr. Johnson. That's quite extraordinary. When you have the medical research coming from Israel and countries, leaders around the world are actually visiting Israel to find out how they're doing, it's definitely not a banana republic. And the list can go on with regard to the environment, desalination of water, with regard to farming and agriculture, cyber security, and of course, the latest in technology. Israel, and it's one of the reasons why the Arab states are now bypassing the Palestinians and dealing directly with Israel, because they have something that Israel is willing to sell and do business with. And the Arab states like that, and they're focused on their future as opposed to the traditional Arab-Israeli conflict. But nevertheless, the question remains, why are we at a fourth election? I think the simplistic answer is as follows. It is because that people inside of a democracy are not willing to accept the will of the people. We don't have any longer a difference between the left or the right. In the olden days, it used to be the left, the Labour Party, the more socialist party, which has been led by leaders such as David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet, and Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and obviously Shimon Peres was prime minister before, actually Yitzhak Rabin in 73, he took over from Golda Meir, and then Shimon Peres became prime minister in 1984 for 2 years in a coalition pact with the Likud leader, Yitzhak Shamir. But since that time, the left-right divide has disappeared. It's no longer there. What you have right now, and it pretty much disappeared in 2015. There was a party that ran, which was the opposition to Likud, led by Benjamin Netanyahu. It called itself the Zionist Camp. In Hebrew, Machaneh Tzioni, the Zionist Camp, or sometimes it was translated as the Zionist Union. It's really the Labour Party, but the Labour Party was losing every single election since the time that Ehud Barak was there, because the Oslo Accords went so disastrously wrong. So people felt that they needed to go somewhere else. And since that time, there's been new parties, Shinui, Kadima, and then the Zionist, the Union, the one I'm speaking about right now, led by Isaac Herzog from the Labour Party. But they changed the name because Tzipi Livni's party, who also broke away from the Likud, and she formed a party called Hatnuah, also has now disappeared, along with Kadima and Shinui and all the other parties. They were supposed to be, according to the polls, neck and neck in the election in 2015 with the Likud. And we all went to bed that night in Jerusalem, and we woke up the following morning, and would you believe, once they counted the votes, that the Likud party was 6 seats ahead of the Zionist Machane Tzioni, the Zionist Union, the Zionist Camp, and that was it. The Labour Party completely tore itself apart. Everyone wanted to become the leader within that party, and basically the people moved away from it, and they were looking for what they call in Israel a new home, a new party as such. Comes along the election of 2019. And one of the reasons why there's an election normally at the beginning of the year, as opposed to the end of the year, is because that in Israel, you have to pass what's known as a budget. Now, the budget is, it has to be passed every year at the end of the year. That's the end of the Gregorian, according to the Gregorian calendar, the Christian year as such, as opposed to the Jewish year. So that means December the 31st. If it's not passed by December the 31st, the government automatically falls and the Knesset is dissolved. So the last budget that was passed, and just in case it's not clear, a budget is basically that everyone agrees, all the coalition partners agree that a certain amount of money goes to each different ministry. So the education ministry gets a certain amount of money, the defense, the transportation to build new, except you get the idea. So the last budget that was passed in Israel was 2016. That was a 2-year part. So that was covering the year 2017 and covering the year 2018. As you get towards the end of the year, the coalition partners with inside a government, and this happens on both sides, left and right, and anti-Bibi and pro-Bibi, they think to themselves, you know what? Maybe if we went to elections, we could get ourselves another few seats. So I'm not going to vote for the coalition budget. We go to elections and they bring down the government. They're ready to join, for example, the Likud again, but they just want they just feel that it's exciting now. Let's call an election. Now, under a system like that, it's generally been very, very stable. Elections every 4 years, except for 2013. 2013 just lasted for 2 years. That was because Yair Lapid pulled out, and a couple of other parties also left as well, the smaller parties. But Yair Lapid was the one that had the 19 seats. 2015 went to 2019. In 2019, again, there's no left anymore. It's about the pro-Bibi, Bibi being Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, or the anti-Bibi. Many candidates were anti-Bibi. They didn't like him. They didn't want him. They couldn't kick him out by the ballot box. So what they decided to do was all those against Bibi, and by the way, I want to make this clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of any political party for the purpose of this talk, apolitical. And when people have asked me, you know what, I don't know who to vote for, I'm giving them ideas based on a process of elimination, but I've never, ever told anyone how to vote. So I just want to make that clear, but this is how I see the situation. In the case with this new party called Blue and White, it was a formation from people from the left, from the center, and from the right, candidates. And they all came together because they had one thing in common. They were against Bibi Netanyahu. They wanted to bring him down. It was time for a change, time for a new prime minister, time for a different approach, time for not necessarily new policies, because they didn't really come up with any specific major change from what the Likud was saying. So you had 3 former IDF generals joining with this party called Blue and White: Benny Gantz, Moshe Ya'alon, and the other one was Ashkenazi, Gabi Ashkenazi, who's the current foreign minister, but he's now resigning. Along with that, you had people on the right joining this party: Hausner, Zvi Hausner, and somebody, again, another name just escapes me right now. Most of it is in my head, but sometimes when you do this nonstop, people on the right in politics. You had somebody on the left, Eisenhower, who was somebody who was part of the unions, in a real socialist. Again, all came together. Now, I knew, based on the little bit of knowledge that I have in Israeli politics, I knew that a party like that would eventually fall apart. I didn't expect it was going to fall apart as quick as it did. In the first election in April 2019, the Likud party got 35 seats, more than what they've got in the last 2 decades. The new Blue and White Party got 35 seats. Wow, it was neck and neck. Both of them claimed that they weren't going to work with each other, and it was split down the middle. Both of them couldn't form a coalition because you need a minimum of 61 seats to make a block for the other 59. And again, just to be clear, and I'm hoping that this is not going over too many heads, the Knesset consists of 120 seats. So therefore, half of 120 is 61 in order to make that block. No candidate could do that. Netanyahu couldn't do that, and Benny Gantz, who led the party, couldn't do that. What happened was the following, that you had somebody called Orly Levy Abikassis. She started her own party called Gesher. She was from the right. She broke away from the right-wing secular Lieberman party, and she sat in the Knesset with her own party. She was just 1 seat at that time because everyone else had left. When it came to the votes, technically, Blue and White had 61 with the right-wing parties, with the center parties, with the left-wing parties, and with the Arabs. All it took was to bring down Benjamin Netanyahu. All 61 would vote against that 59. And although there wouldn't be a real government as such, it would be a minority government being supported by the Arabs, some of them radical Arabs, who are certainly the Ballard Party is against the state of Israel and openly says that. The Ballard Party is a faction within the Arab list, within the joint list. And she said, I can't do this. I cannot vote with the Arabs to bring down the right-wing government. It doesn't make sense. Why are we doing this? She was ridiculed and she was condemned, and she ended up by those on the Blue and White Party really, well, not speaking very favorably of her, is to put it quite politely. We then went to another election. That election was later in the year, so that was September of 2019. The result was the Likud party with 32 seats. The Blue and White Party, 33 seats. Everyone got excited. They've done it, they won, etc. Bibi's gone, go home. I wasn't worried either way, because I knew that either side could not form a coalition. The numbers were still split. The left-wing parties wouldn't work with the right-wing parties. The right-wing Lieberman wouldn't work with Likud because he hates Netanyahu, and he certainly hates the religious parties. And by the way, this is probably an ideal time for me, because I was reminded by Vicky earlier on of somebody who was trying to come into the meeting. I'm not sure if he's with us right now, but I retweeted a tweet yesterday from my account from somebody by the name of Rafa Kafka. It's a Brazilian American lawyer. I'm not sure if he's with us this evening, but he tweeted the following, and it was in response to something that Lieberman had either said. Victor Lieberman is from the right-wing party, but his campaign right now is totally anti-religious. Now, he says it's against the strictly Orthodox. You know, if you're middle of the road, that's okay, but the strictly Orthodox, the ones who keep the Torah, the ones who are proper strict in terms of Shabbat, and the ones who dress in the traditional Yerushalmi dress, white shirt and black suit, and maybe they have a beard, and they wear a hat. You know, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, everyone wore a hat. And Frank Sinatra wore one, Dean Martin wore one, so why not? And so Victor Lieberman is totally against the religious, doesn't want any religious influence whatsoever within the government, wants them out, and has made some very strong statements. In response to this, this chap, the Brazilian-American lawyer, says, and I'm reading here, I'm quoting, that's why my eyes are looking away from the camera, this fall, referring to Lieberman, started this mess of infinite elections trying to undermine Portrayed, meaning the strictly orthodox, despite basic democratic trends showing how impossible his goals were. And now, as a result of this refusing to sit in a right-wing government with the Likud party in 2019, the two elections in 2019, and the one last year, he will now get 10 times much worse. And I interpret that as follows. And that is that the religious parties have got a major campaign to draw. Many of the religious people don't vote, but they're drawing out as many people as possible to come out and vote this time because of the anti-religious rhetoric coming from Lieberman's party. So, and I think what this tweet is saying is, you've really done it now. The fact that you keep saying that, now you're going to make it 10 times worse. So that's how I understood the tweet. But if he's with us, maybe he will come back in at the end when we have an opportunity for questions and answers. So that was the second election. Nobody could put together a coalition. We then went to a third election, unprecedented, which was March 2020. The result, Likud party, 36 seats, the highest Netanyahu's ever got. The Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz, 33 seats. It was clear that the trend was changing, that people were moving to Netanyahu, okay, only by 3 seats, and that perhaps the support was going away from Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz then made a decision, and I think it was the right decision at the time. He saw the country was unemployed, 20%, over 1 million people unemployed. Some people were starving, hungry. There was a lockdown. People were dying of COVID. The coronavirus was out of control. To date, we have almost 6,100 people dead out of the coronavirus. So I know, of course, it's much more in the United Kingdom, and of course, more in the United States, but it's a tiny country, 9.3 million people. And Benny Gantz calculated that we can't keep spending this type of money on one election after another, which is costing the country 369 billion shekels. That's almost $1 billion, $1 billion rather, of every time we go to an election. By the way, this election right now on Tuesday is costing twice as much as that because there's special COVID booths set up. There's one COVID booth for those who are in isolation, and there's another one, and that's a drive-through, by the way. So you drive through, just like you take your takeaway. And the other one is a shuttle bus service, those who have COVID but are able to get down to vote. So the shuttle bus service are taking them specifically into polling stations that have been designated just for those who have the coronavirus. So twice as much money has now been spent for these elections. So the last election, again, with 36 seats, Benny Gantz broke away half of his faction. And some people jumped ship and said, we can't do this. We said we were never going to vote. We were never going to sit with Netanyahu. So we cannot break our word. As if politicians don't break their words. Just look at the situation. Look, you want to spend billions and billions more for a fourth election, and then what happens on the fifth one? The polls were showing nothing was going to change. Why you just get into government and start to sort, and there were security issues as well. There were rockets also coming over from Gaza once again. The intelligence coming from Lebanon, the hundreds of thousands of rockets aimed at Israel. They're looking at, I think it's 200,000 rockets, long-range rockets. When the next war comes with Lebanon, we're looking here at least 200 rockets falling on the main cities every single day. And Benny Gantz rightly calculated that we've got to work with Netanyahu. And I think it was the right decision. Yesh Atid broke away from Benny Gantz. Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid, who is #2 in the polling right now. So just bear in mind that there's a poll And that polling, and I've spent hours and hours and hours looking over so many polls per week since the end of November. Since the end of November. And I've pretty much been doing that for the last 2.5 years. So I've got a pretty good grasp of the polls. Netanyahu with the Likud party is on 30 seats right now. His nearest rival is the one who refused to join with Benny Gantz and broke away, is Yair Lapid, secular, center to left. He's gone up to 20 seats right now. So Netanyahu is a good 8, 9, some polls say 10 seats ahead. I'll come on to the other two right-wing parties in just a moment. Again, nobody could put together this coalition the last time, which was, we're talking about March. So they put together a coalition. It was never going to last. It was a temporary coalition. And the reason why it was never going to last is because what you had was the Labour Party breaking away, yet led by Amir Peretz. Amir Peretz also swore he was never going to sit with Netanyahu, and he said that once before, about 10 years ago, and he broke his word. And he broke up the Labour Party, by the way, so there was no more Labour Party in the Knesset at that time. And there was two people from the right wing. They formed a new faction called Derech Eretz, the way of the land as such, and they also joined, and they demanded, I think it was 15 ministries. So you've got a government which is paying itself a lot of money. The country is unemployed. The economy is falling apart. Major security threat. People are dying of COVID. And they're extending their cabinet to 34, 35, 36 ministries, plus the deputy ministers, all on high salaries. And Benny Gantz lost support because of the demands that he made on all of these men. And Netanyahu had no choice. He had to agree to it. He also agreed to something which is called an alternate prime minister. So he would serve for 1.5 years, and then Benny Gantz would serve for 1.5 years. Now, most people who know anything about politics knew and know that 1 week in Israeli politics is a long, long time. I know that's a well-known saying, but really, things change just like that in 24 hours. Anything can happen. That's what was going through Netanyahu's mind. Anything can happen. We'll worry about that at the time. Let's make progress. Let's get this government together. And by the way, Donald Trump was still in power at this time. There was, of course, the deals on the table with regard to the UAE and Bahrain. And of course, other countries were being talked about. These were the two main ones. There was the relations with Oman and Saudi Arabia. And Netanyahu thought, we should pursue this. There was an agreement which was made between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. And also Benny Gantz promised certain things, that they would not appoint a police chief. They would not appoint the new attorney general. And there will be certain things, although they got the justice ministry, there would be certain things that they wouldn't do. So when people say that it was Netanyahu who broke the agreement because he wouldn't allow Benny Gantz to become prime minister in November of this year, well, that's true. He did break the agreement. But also, Benny Gantz also broke his side of the agreement as well by doing things that weren't agreed with regard to the Ministry of Justice and with regard to the other issues that I just mentioned. Eventually, it was going to fall apart. Benny Gantz's popularity was going down, and Netanyahu calculated that the polls were, by the way, saying at this time that Benny Gantz was polling around 6 seats, 5 seats. So Netanyahu calculated that I cannot let a man who was recognized as the left or the center to left, let a man who has got the support of the equivalent of 4 to 6 Knesset seats become prime minister. So he held off on passing the budget. You might have heard of that before. The budget needed to be passed urgently because there was no budget passed, and he kept putting it off. And he promised the news networks, and he promised Benny Gantz, we'll pass it, we'll agree to it. Benny Gantz wanted it to be a 2-year budget, because that would ensure that he would become prime minister in November, but it wouldn't just be for a few weeks. In other words, you'd have a full year into 2022, if you get my drift. That makes sense. This is yes, and I can see a few people, but this is you can do this if you want. If I've gone over your head.
Can I come in for a minute, James?
Good point. Yes, I'm waiting for someone to come in.
Okay, all right. So you described that the Knesset has got 120 seats, and in order to have a majority, you need to have 61 seats, and yet the major parties like Likud and Blue and White are hovering around 30 seats, 35 seats. And that's, of course, nowhere near the majority. And most people would understand that means that in order to form a government, you have to have a coalition with some other parties to help you form a government. And this is only possible because Israel has a PR voting system. So to simplify things just for a few minutes, could you just explain to people a little bit about the PR process and how it works, and how the 30-odd parties which might be fighting this election, from those, only about a dozen will end up in parliament, and why that is? So it's a complicated question, but I want a really simple answer.
Yes, so I'm glad you said that, the word simple, because I have a feeling that perhaps some of the things that I was saying was deep analysis. And I'm sorry, I apologize if it went over some of the people's heads over here. So I'm sorry to make it a little bit, that seems to be the problem as to why we've gone to the fourth election. But in simplistic terms, to answer your original question, it's simply because people do not like Benjamin Netanyahu. They do not respect the results of the election. In other words, last time he got 36 seats, and they refuse to sit with him. And they're willing to have another election and another election and another election and just basically make the country bankrupt. This particular question with regard to 30 seats, if Netanyahu does get 30 seats, and of course anything can happen, but the polls have pretty much been consistent. Netanyahu has two key allies. So the two religious parties, United Torah Judaism is one of them, and Shas is another one. They've got 15 seats, so that brings it up to 45. You've got another very small party called the Religious Zionists. It's a right-wing party, and it's actually aligned itself with a far right-wing party called Otzma Yehudit. And the leader of that party, I won't mention his name because probably many people won't know. I mean, I do. Itamar bin Gvir, in case you don't think I know his name, but they're expected to get 4 seats or maybe 5 seats. So let's do the math together. 30 plus 15 is 45, plus 5, let's say it's 50. Still short of 11 seats. There's another right-wing party called Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett. He also wants Netanyahu to go home. He doesn't like him. He used to be part of his team, but they really don't get on with each other. Naftali Bennett has left the door open, very smartly, I might add. He might join with him, or he might join with the other right-wing people to oust him, but he wants to become the prime minister. He's now polling at around 11, 12 seats. So that's enough to get just over that mark of 61, maybe 62, if the polls are right. But he's also going to demand at least 10 ministries, which is not going to make him very popular. Gideon Sa'ar broke away from the Likud party. He can't get on with Netanyahu. I'm going to rise up against Netanyahu in the Likud party. I'm going to force a leadership contest, which he did a year ago. And we're going to run together, and I will take over the Likud party. He lost miserably. He got less than 20% of the vote. He said, okay, I lost. Now I place my allegiance behind Netanyahu. But a short time afterwards, well, it was about 8 or 9 months, he decided to break away and form his own party. I will never sit with Netanyahu. I would rather be in the opposition. He started polling at 21 seats. He's gone down from 21, 18, 17, 15, 14. 2 polls last week showed him at 9 seats. Campaign dreadful. There's no other policies he has which is different from Likud except one. Netanyahu has to go. It's not enough for the people. So I agree to get onto your question, Sammy, I agree with the PR system. It works in Israel. The last couple of years has just been a blip. It's not because of the PR system. It's because that parties do not accept the result of the electorate. If Netanyahu's Likud party loses by 5, 6, 10 seats, that's it. As they say, bye-bye Bibi. Go home Bibi. It's an expression in Hebrew. Lech labaita. But he's not. Despite the fact that there's 3 indictments against Netanyahu, and we can talk about that if we have time at the end, the people are saying, you, the establishment, you, the media, you, the newspapers and the radios and the television networks, almost every one of them is anti-Bibi. But the people are saying, you're not going to tell us what to vote for. It's us. This is a democracy, the only democracy here in the Middle East. We will decide how to place our votes. And if we choose the Likud is the party for us. In other words, they're willing to overlook these indictments. And if the trial will take 2 or 3 years anyhow, and whatever happens in 2 or 3 years, if he's found guilty, well, then we're worried about that in 3 years' time. Maybe you go to jail, maybe he'll be let off, but a lot can happen between now and 3 years' time in a place like Israel, I can assure you. But allow the people to decide. That's the reason why we keep going to elections. It's not the PR system. But if you want my view, what needs to change is, in the UK, and I think most of you are watching from the UK, we might have somebody from Brazil, might have somebody from the United States, a couple of people from Israel, and I know somebody's watching from Brussels. In my view, what needs to change is that you need to set up what's known in the United Kingdom as constituencies. In America, it's called districts. So in other words, you split up Israel into, let's say, 60 or 120. I was a big campaigner for this in Israel in the 90s and in the early noughties. And I campaigned for changing the electoral system. So at one time, it was actually 1.5% minimum threshold in order to get into the Knesset. We campaigned for it to go up to 5%. It's currently at 3.25%. So it's better than it was. It could be better. So in other words, we have 39 political parties running right now. It's not a record. 2 years ago, it was 47 political parties. About 13 of them maximum will get into the Knesset. So why do the other 2/3 of the parties run? Because some of them are being funded, 1 or 2 of them by the EU, and other groups and organizations that have money. And it's a gimmick. It just proves what a vibrant democracy Israel is. And by the way, there's a number of Arab parties that are also running as well, as in a vibrant democracy. Yeah. But I was just going to end, and I think you want to come in, Sammy, but the PR system needs to change, whereby that you have candidates standing in constituencies, and therefore, just like here in the UK, and therefore that particular one candidate who wins will then end up going to the Knesset. But it doesn't work like that at all. It's about leaders of political parties. And let's say for me, it's James Marlow starts a new political party. And by the way, I did think about it. I did.
So unlike the UK, people vote for a party. They don't vote for individual members of parliament. That's right.
I don't think that's true. I know a number of people, including myself in the UK, and I also have a vote in the UK. I vote for the local candidate. I know most people don't do that, but I find out who the local candidate is and what his views or what her views are, and stick with that local candidate. Yeah, it's normally with the same political party in an area where I'm registered in Northwest London. But generally, I advise people, speak to your local candidate and find out who it is. But it's right, most people don't know that and they vote for their party. That's true.
Yeah, but in Israel, people vote for the party.
In Israel, they vote for personalities. Right. So now they're looking at, do they prefer Naftali Bennett? The party is Yamina. Do they prefer Gidon Sa'ar? The party is New Hope. Do they prefer Benjamin Netanyahu? The party is Likud. Or do they prefer the left wing, Yair Lapid? That party is Yesh Atid. Or the Labour. Right. And this is how we'll get on to this.
But they don't vote for the individuals. They vote for the party that person represents.
Well, on the actual slip itself, on the slip,
exactly.
you're looking for a number. Well, actually, it's a Hebrew letter, so it doesn't even say the name of the party on the slips. Let me give you. I did this the other day, so just happen to have this one. Not sure if this is going to work in front of this camera over here, but when you go into the voting booth, for all those Israelis, somebody was watching from is watching from Rehovot. So if he has voted beforehand, he will be very familiar with this. You go into the voting booth, and you actually have a tray of slips. There should be 39, but there's normally a couple of them which is missing. And you choose which Hebrew letter you want to vote for. What do you mean a Hebrew letter? I'm looking for a party, as you say, Sammy. No, they're not written down as Hebrew, the words in Hebrew as the parties. They're written down as letters. You have to know, A, how to read Hebrew, and B, which letter represents your party.
Exactly.
So, for example, I don't know if you can see this over here, but this is because of the background. But basically, it's a little slip like this. The letters on here basically are Mem, Het, Lamed. Most people understand that stands for the Likud party. Another one right over here, which is suddenly up. There you go. So this is Aleph, Mem, Tet, Emet. Stands for the Labour Party. That's their call. Bet.
Exactly. So they are representing the parties. So
yes,
the slip represents a party. It doesn't represent Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett or anybody like that. Now, the parties need to have a minimum number of votes for them to qualify for seats. And you're saying that's 3.5% or something like that.
3.25. It's a minimum of 4 seats.
Exactly. So if you don't get 3.25%, you're eliminated and you don't have any seats. And that's how we reduce the 39 parties to the dozen or so parties that eventually end up in the Knesset.
And it's important to say that if that party does not cross the minimum threshold, all of those votes get thrown in the bin. And those votes work out between, depending upon how many people the voter turn out, because it's a PR system, between 150 to 160,000 votes. That's quite a lot.
What does that represent as a percentage of the votes?
Approximately 2.95 to 3.10.
Right, so quite a lot of votes are wasted. So you were talking about the different parties. Give us an idea, because you mentioned the Arab parties, the religious parties, the left and right parties. And the Arab parties, I think, are quite important. People don't realize that in Israel, not people on this call, but people in general don't realize that Arabs in Israel can vote for Arab parties. And as you said, one of them actually is against the existence of the state of Israel. So it's important for people to understand exactly that it is a democracy and the Arabs can vote and do vote for Arab parties, as well as religious parties, left and right parties, and so on.
Yeah, we take it for granted here in Israel because it's just, Arabs have as much rights as the Jews and the Christians and everyone else. So it's odd outside of Israel that people do talk about how the Arabs don't have rights when there are 2 million Arabs living in Israel and just under 1.8 million Arabs, just under, did I say just under 2 million? I think I said that. Just under 1.8 have Israeli citizenship and therefore have the right to vote. There is at least 6 different Arab parties running. Now, 4 of them have joined up together. And I've talked about this quite a lot in other talks, and I think this might be interesting to your viewers. So if I just allow just to spend a couple of minutes, literally 2 minutes, and I'll be conscious of the time, because I know you want to ask many questions. One of these parties is the Hadash Party. It's the Communist Party, Arab Communist Party. The second one, it's got a very big problem with Israel. The second one is the Ballard Party. The Ballard Party is the radical secular nationalist party. Azmi Bashara was a former member of Knesset with that party. He was on the telephone when the Hezbollah in Lebanon were firing rockets, thousands of rockets at Israel. And he was on the phone to them, directing the rockets as to a little bit more southwest, you'll hit that Jewish city, you'll hit that Jewish community. He fled Israel. He got to Syria before the authorities managed to get him. And it was quite a sensation. There's been other radical MKs from that party called Ballard. Ballard, again, a part of what's known as the Joint List. The Joint List was the 3rd largest political party in Israel for the last 5 years, but won't be this time because one of the parties has dropped out. So you've got Hadash, the communists, Ballard, the radical secular nationalists. Then you've got Ta'al. Ta'al is an Arab religious list. And the other party was Ra'am, which is the Islamic United List. So those four parties merged and got 15 seats. In the last, actually, they went down to 13 seats. Now, it's something that we Jewish people can learn from, because when you disagree with somebody in your political party, whether it's be Labour, Likud, or any of the parties, unfortunately, what happens, you storm out of the party, you resign. It's happened a lot on the Likud party. You start your own political party and you vow to bring down the prime minister. I'm going to be the next prime minister. James Marlow, vote for me. But you don't have the support. These Arab parties have got nothing whatsoever in common except their dislike for Israel. Ballard hates Israel, but let's be moderate and say their dislike for Israel. They join together. They have completely and utterly different feelings towards Israel in terms of its social and economic issues, in terms of its security, in terms of its funding. But they're willing to stick together as a pact. The party that's dropped out is a party called Ra'am, which I think I mentioned, the Islamic list. It's led by Mansour Abbas. No relation to Mahmoud Abbas, by the way. Mansour Abbas is smart. And he says it doesn't make sense. We spend, every time there's an election that comes around, we've joined together. We now have 15 seats, 13 technically right now, but it was 15 in the one before. We're getting all the Arabs to vote for us, which is great, but we're not doing it. We're not benefiting them. There is so much violence in the Arab communities from Arabs to Arabs. In the Arab communities, unfortunately, there's very much organized crime. The police can't get a hold of it. There's an average of more than 100 Arabs who are killed every single year by organized crime. It's out of control. And this Arab politician, member of Knesset, rightly so in my opinion, Mansour Abbas, is saying, we've got to start working with the government. Let's be smart. The religious parties work with governments and they get money for their schools and for their communities and for those poor people within their communities, special meals that come round. We could do the same thing. Why do we always have to oppose the government, whether it's on the left or whether it's on the right or the center? Doesn't make sense. We've got all these votes. To me, that's smart. Mansour Abbas broke away. He was ridiculed by a lot of the Arabs. His party is now polling a minimum of 4 seats. It'll be quite something if he passes, because he's willing, initially there was talk that he was willing to prop up the Netanyahu government, but then he was getting ridiculed. And he just actually 2 days ago met with Yair Lapid and say, stop saying I'm in the pockets of Netanyahu. I could be in your pocket as well. It depends what the result is going to be.
But these Arab parties are joining up together in order to have an accumulated vote of more than 3.5%, because individually they probably won't have that many votes, and none of them will have seats in the Knesset. Is that correct? But he's decided he can actually manage on his own to get 3.25%, because if he doesn't, he gets absolutely nothing.
So you make a very good point there. One of the it was when we raised the minimum threshold to 3.25%, there was a lot of anti-Israel feeling from outside of the country, because they said the only reason why the Israelis are doing it is actually to stop the Arabs from running, which wasn't true. I mean, it was really to stop so many small parties, whether they're Arab or whether they're Jewish or whatever, they're right wing, left wing, center, start working with the main parties. And some candidates were doing that. So you're right, those 4 parties did join together because they could see they were some of them were passing the minimum threshold, but some of them perhaps would not. But they managed to become a political force. Ra'am has totally disagreed now with the other 3 leaders of the other 3 parties and said, I believe that I can get the support, and is now polling at 4 seats. Now he may fall below that, and of course all those votes will go into the bin. And the reason why he may fall is because Netanyahu is actually campaigning for the Arab votes. He has, the Likud party probably won't get to 36 seats, but he's placed for the very first time an Israeli Arab on the Likud list. In other words, if he gets 36 seats, number 36 will be an Arab Israeli for the Likud party. And he believes, there was a survey that came out just on Thursday, last Thursday, done by the Democrats Institute. It showed that 1 in every 3 Israeli Arabs want Netanyahu to remain as prime minister. And by the way, even in the 2015 election, and certainly every election since then, more Arabs vote for the Likud party than they do for the Labour Party.
And what attracts them to the Likud party then?
Well, that's a good question. Stability, perhaps, the feeling that the Likud party is tough on security. One of the reasons why the Labour Party totally disappeared last year from the Knesset, and since that time, what has happened is Merav Michaeli managed to get control of the party, a woman, by the way, the only woman leading a political party that is likely to get into the Knesset. But again, she's very close to the minimum threshold. She is polling at 5 to 6 seats, but they're still talking about maybe Labour might go below the threshold. And by the way, so will the far left-wing Meretz party. But they consider the Labour Party not credible, certainly when it comes to security. The failed Oslo Accords, much of the country has not forgiven the Labour Party for going ahead with those, trying the Oslo Accords, but kept moving along so fast, despite the fact that sometimes 2 or 3 suicide bombings per week were taking place and killing dozens of Israelis. And I myself was a survivor of 3 of those and heard and saw many others because they were everywhere, certainly in the Jerusalem area. So the last Labour prime minister in Israel was in 2001, January 2001. He lasted for just 1 year, and then Ariel Sharon took over. His name was Ehud Barak, famous for the Camp David II talks. That was when Bill Clinton sat down at the table and said to Yasser Arafat, Yasser, take this deal that he's offering you. You'll never get a better deal. 95% of the West Bank with part of Jerusalem as its capital. You'll never get a better deal. But he officially turned it down. That was 2000. And of course, the Intifada, the suicide bombings intensified after that.
That's another long discussion we can have about peace deals. But I've got a couple of more questions, and then I'd like to open it up to other people to ask questions. So if they can think about it, if they want to ask it, that'll be fine. If they want to put it in the chat, that will be fine. So another question I have is, you kept saying that Netanyahu might get a majority, which means that he might not, and therefore the anti-Netanyahu camp will get a majority. What are the chances of that happening?
No, it's not. That's I can see your how you came to that answer, but that's the complicating. And I was trying to lead on to that, but I think it went over people's heads, which is fair enough. And I appreciate you stopping me and jumping in on that point. But to keep
just
it
try
really
and simplify, just try and explain why it's
okay.
unlikely that the other side will get a majority.
So there's only 3 ways that this can happen for a government to come out, not from next Tuesday, because that's polling day. And it will take a couple of months, by the way, for a coalition to come together, if indeed there are the numbers over there. But there's only 3 possible, according to the way that I've worked this out anyway. Number 1 is that Netanyahu can form a coalition with the numbers that I said beforehand, probably with Naftali Bennett, who hates Netanyahu and Netanyahu hates him, but they will come together on the basis that Naftali Bennett, who leads the right-wing Yamina party. This is the ironic thing about it. I mean, we're talking here about an Israeli election whereby out of the 120 seats, 80 of them are going to go to right-wing parties. And yet the right wing can't work with each other. Go and figure. But these are the scenarios. Either Netanyahu will form it and he will be the prime minister. That's number 1. The second scenario is a possibility of a left government. That will be led by Yair Lapid, who's got 20 seats. And he will bring in, let's say, the Labour Party. Labour Party, let's say they get 6 seats. That's 26. Somebody else do the math for me.
All right.
Then you've got Meretz. Meretz if they get over the line, I don't think they will. My gut feeling tells me that their voters are going to Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, to boost him. And I think they're going to fail. But let's say that they do. 4 seats. So whatever
30.
that number is. And
30.
then there's only one other party, which is Blue and White. Blue and White led by Benny Gantz. Remember them? 33 seats from last year. He's been told, leave, drop out, you'll waste 100,000 votes. He's in to the end. He's running. Now, most of the polls say he's going to get the 4 seats, maybe 5 seats. I think he will cross that line. Benny Gantz will obviously work with Yair Lapid, although they fell out terribly last year over breaking the whole party up. That's all you've got. You have no one else. The third list, the joint list, which is the 3 Arab parties, they're polling at 8 seats. They won't go into the government. They might support the government from outside, but you still haven't got the numbers. So that one doesn't work. The third and final scenario is as follows. That is a right-wing government without Netanyahu. But again, to me, the numbers still don't work out. So that's Naftali Bennett, Yamina. And remember, although it is a party that you're voting for, the voters are voting. If you ask, and I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, they don't say the name of the party, except for the religious parties, by the way. The religious party they do say, or they give the letter. Gimel, for example. I'm voting Gimel. Gimel is the United Torah Judaism Party. But they will say the name of the leader. So I'm voting for Saar. I'm voting for Bennett. I'm voting for Bibi. That's what they say. So let's work this out. Gideon Saar, let's say, gets 10 seats. Naftali Bennett's 12 seats. And then you've got Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, 7 seats.
Well, it's close.
It's close. Hang on, that doesn't work.
Because you say that you could say the Arab parties might be willing to support an anti-government, an anti-Netanyahu government.
Yes, but they're not going to support a right-wing government, not the joint list. That's not going to happen. The joint list will be associated with the left. The other party, Ra'am, may do, but that's only going to be 4 seats. The only way for this to happen is that they bring in Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, with his 20 seats. However, you're still hovering around 50, 55. But the problem is that both Bennett on the right and Gideon Saar on the right has said that the majority of the country is right-wing. Yair Lapid is left-wing. Therefore, we will not allow Yair Lapid to become prime minister. All 3 of them want to become prime minister. Lapid, he says, I'm the second most popular party. I should be PM. Naftali Bennett says, no, I should be because I'm the right wing. I'm the 3rd biggest party. And then Gideon Saar will say, hang on, what about me? I should be the prime minister. I've got the experience.
So it looks like Netanyahu's going to be prime minister again.
I think the only scenario is this election, to sum it all up, is whether Netanyahu can form an election, form a coalition in the next 2 months. If he can, and hopefully we have a stable government for the next 4 years, then we're okay for the next 4 years. And of course, we'll see what happens with his trial. If he can't, that means we go to a 5th election, because it's about either Netanyahu forms a government or everyone else says we go to a 5th election. In other words, they're not willing to work with him. That's what they say. There's just one other final scenario, and that is, I'm not convinced when Gideon Saar says he will never sit with Netanyahu, I'm not convinced he means it. Because if we go to a 5th election, I don't think his voters will forgive him. And if he gets 9 or 10 seats, I think it could go down to 7 or 6. Because as I said before, the people are fed up with this. 639 billion shekels. This election is costing us because of the 2 extra COVID booths, which is equivalent to not much change from 2 million English pounds, if that helps you.
Can I just ask you to touch on the American influence, if any, with Biden now in the White House, if that's going to have any impact at all on what happens?
None whatsoever.
That's a nice short answer. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions now from people in the audience, which I'd like to present to you, James. The first one is from Evie Ed, and she said that you mentioned the EU is putting some money into a couple of parties. Why are they doing that, and what's their purpose? What's their objective? And which are they? Which parties are they?
Well, I will have to double check on that. In previous years, in Israel, they have up to now 2 green parties. There was a green party, and then there was a breakaway. There was a Green Leaf Party, then there was an official green party. All these movements have bases and have officers and have pressure groups inside the Brussels Parliament and in the Strasbourg Parliament as well. So there's a certain amount of funding that does come from different groups and organizations whereby they can be represented in various parliaments around the world. Certainly the Green Party, the Green Movement, wants to push its equivalent political parties around the Western world. And Israel is no exception to that. So somebody funds these political parties that have to register and pay lots of money in order to run in the Knesset elections. So that's an example of parties which are running. And they just get funded.
Right. There's another question from John Perkins. He picked up that you used to work for the BBC, and he's asking what's your view about the BBC and whether it's biased against Israel when you point to people like Jeremy Bowen and the kind of reports he sends out the country. So what is your view as an ex-BBC person about the BBC and its reporting of, in particular, about Israel and the Middle East?
Good evening, John. Well, firstly, let me just clarify. I was never an employee of the BBC. So most people, certainly today and over the years, have been what's known as outside freelance people. So in other words, when you're in a certain area, you can get a telephone call from ITN or CNN or Al Jazeera as an outside correspondent. You're down on their list. And I get these calls all the time. For example, with regard to the Israeli election, as you know, can you come on and talk about the election tonight, tomorrow, something like that. So in the case with the BBC, that's what has taken place. And I think a couple of times we did a couple of things on Gaza. Look, I don't want to say anything specifically about the BBC. I'll make a general statement. By the way, it's interesting you bring up Jeremy Bowden. Jeremy Bowman.
Yeah.
It's Bowman, isn't it?
Bowen.
Bowen, yes, thank you, Bowen, yes. And I should remember that, and I'll tell you why, is because at the election before last, I was, when the polls had closed, so you get a choice. I was in Jerusalem, and the parties are having their dancing sessions or where the members meet, etc. And then the leader will come onto the stage about midnight or 1 o'clock. And it's normally done at the convention center in Tel Aviv. So the government press office just asked some of us, do you want to lift down there? We got a shuttle bus going down there. So, and I said, yeah, you drive. I'll jump on the bus. I decided to go to the Likud after party. And I was actually wanting to stand on a chair just to take some pictures of the stage. And there's all these Likud banners and the television cameras were everywhere. And this guy is standing right next to me and a massive, great big stomach. And I took a picture of him, actually. He said, "That's my chair. Don't touch that chair." I went, okay, I was just going to stand. No, it's our chair. Don't touch that. Who did it turn out to be?
Jeremy.
And I got a picture of him. I got a picture of him as he turned away, and I took a picture of him like this. He's got a big, he had a big stomach. And he's actually quite tall as well. Look,
but could you try and give us your view about the BBC in general?
Yeah, I will try and give you a view about news networks in general. And you know what? I can use my personal experience when I was with a network called Euronews. Euronews, maybe some people haven't heard of it in the UK. It's quite popular across Europe. And I remember years and years ago, I was staying in a hotel in Jerusalem, and I turned on the telly, and the first channel that came up was Euronews, and I was doing a report on that. Well, it was me, which was quite funny because I was in Lyon, and yet I just traveled to Jerusalem. But there was a case whereby that I was doing something for Euronews, and it was on Gaza, actually. It was several years. You know what? This is back in the year 2000. And I'm hesitating because I'm trying to remember it. This wasn't prepared in my mind. But briefly, without too many ers and airs, the report was about Israeli soldiers going into Gaza. There was a shootout between some Islamists, and there was something like about 14 or 15 Palestinian Arabs killed, and the Israeli soldiers left, etc. So I was given a reel of images which were taken at that time from Reuters. So that's the reason why most networks today, to cut back on their money, their budget, their salaries, they take the pictures from a wire service called Reuters or Associated Press, as opposed to having correspondents all over the world. And they draw from that, they edit it all up. So of course, some of the pictures, and I had to voice something for about a minute and a half, which I looked at the pictures, and Israeli troops went in, and there was a shootout, etc., etc., and there was 14 Palestinian Arabs killed, and there was 3 or 4 injured, whatever the report was. And right at the end, the last 7 or 8 seconds, literally, out of a minute and a half, 7 or 8 seconds, and I said, and in response, the Israeli government said that this was in response to the Israeli bus bombing last week in Tel Aviv that killed 7 Israelis. Boom, that was it. That's when I came out. About 15, 20 minutes later, the head of news came from his office and came, James, I want to talk to you. And I realized that this is being recorded and there's a lot of people watching. So I'm not talking off my cuff. I realize that this is going out and it's probably going to be posted as well. So I'm quite comfortable with saying this because it happened, and it happens quite a lot. So the boss says to me, I forget his name now, but whoever it was, the boss says to me, and by the way, it was run by ITN at the time, says, James, this report was about Gaza. Show me where a spokesperson for the Israeli government is in this clip. And I said, there isn't any. He said, exactly. Why are you talking about Israel and what the Israeli government said when this was about Gaza and the killing of Palestinian Arabs? I said, but my report was mostly about the deaths of the Palestinians. He said, yes, that's right. But I think it's right to explain why the Israeli troops suddenly went in there and a shootout occurred. And he said, no, that's not the report. That's not the story. The story is the Palestinian Arabs being killed. It happened several times. And in the end, I lost my job because I wasn't part of that clique. I wasn't part of the group, of the format, of the hevra, as such, as we say in Hebrew. And I thought, you know what? I told a few people, they said, you're better off out of it. If that's what goes on there, you're better off. But in defense of some correspondents, and I'm not defending them, I just want to make that clear, but what they would say is, and I try and be fair on both sides, you decide. What they would say is that we need access to certain leaders in the Middle Eastern world, in the Palestinian world. If we start making reports against the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, if we start criticizing Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman, the president of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, we will lose access to those leaders. We will lose our press pass to get to Ramallah. Then our network is going to fire us because we can't get that interview, and they take someone else on. And the same thing happens in Gaza. And I know this because journalists have told me, and I'm thinking of a particular journalist right now. There's a Jewish girl, she's Israeli. I got her the job because she took me out for lunch once in Tel Aviv. And she said, thank you. It was you because I couldn't cover Yasser Arafat's funeral on a Friday afternoon in Ramallah. Because I'm observant. So actually, I'm so stupid. I was so desperate to do it. I was calling around trying to find a Jewish family in Ramallah, of all places, to say maybe I could stay over for the Shabbat, for the Jewish Sabbath. Any Jews there? No Jews in Ramallah. And I thought, what are you doing, James? What is the matter with you? Are you nuts? You can't do it. What's wrong with you? And I recommended somebody else. And she, as a result of that, got the job on this network. She is so anti-Israel. And I once saw her, it was several years ago, and she got me on her network once, and I spoke to her on the phone a couple of times. And I said, your reports are dreadful. She said, I know. But how can you say some of that stuff? You know it's not true. She says, James, if I don't say it, they're going to get rid of me, and they're bringing someone else much worse than me. And I thought to myself, you know, thank God I left it. Thank God I'm not really going after a correspondent salary position that will help me put bread and water on the table each week just for that, because I just can't do that. It's false news. It's fake news.
So the networks do not report the full truth because of that reason.
Yeah, I mean, the famous, just to end on just one final case on this, the famous case is, we're a little bit off the subject, but I'm happy if this has got an interest to your followers, to your viewers. But the famous case was, if you remember, the 9/11. Oh, it's going back several years. Wow, 20 years. So there was an Italian journalist that took a shot of some dancing Palestinians. It's not clear how many dancing Palestinians there were in Ramallah, or it's possibly in Jenin, and they were giving out sweets on the day of 9/11 20 years ago, or just under 20 years ago. That Italian journalist managed to get that footage out, and it got transmitted on the network, and it was picked up by some other networks. Then it was played down. Arafat was asked his opinion on this, and he said, well, there's a few Palestinian Arabs, come on. It looked more than a few, I have to tell you. That journalist lost her, I think it was lost her job. And she gave some reports a couple of years later to a Jewish group. I remember in Jerusalem it was at the time. And she explained, she says, the Palestinian Authority took away my passes. I could not get any access whatsoever to any Palestinian Authority people. None of them would deal with me. None of them would speak with me. They basically sent me to Coventry, an expression in the UK. I lost my job because the network just said, we've got no use for you. Goodbye.
Yeah. So I've got one more question. I know that Ian Wise is on the call, and he's from Israel, and I was going to ask him to maybe give us an Israeli point of view to what you've said this evening. So I'll give him a few minutes to think about it. And I'd like to ask you, what are the chances of yet another close election that will lead to a fifth election?
55 to 45, 55%, sorry, 45%, in my opinion, that there will be a fifth election, because it comes down to Gideon Sa'ar if Naftali Bennett doesn't get more than 9 or 10 seats. And if Gideon Sa'ar refuses to join Netanyahu, in other words, refuses, let's be clear on this, not refuses to join Netanyahu because there's 3 indictments against him, refuses to accept the will of the people of Israel. Again, if the Likud party have got 10 seats more than any other party, then it's right that he should have the right to form a coalition. If he gets 10 seats less, then he's lost. That's what I think it comes down to.
Okay. There's a question from Rachel about, I think, votes allowed in envelopes, which might be a total of 600,000. And could that possibly lead to suspicion that the election might be rigged or stolen? And if that is the case, will the Supreme Court intervene?
I'm hesitating because I'm just wondering whether Rachel saw one of my tweets, either today or yesterday, asking...
She's shaking her head. She's shaking her head.
Shaking means no.
No.
Okay, I can't see Rachel, so forgive me for that. Okay, so this was, I was told yesterday by somebody, actually a senior person who used to work in the Prime Minister's office and worked very closely with the Prime Minister for many years. And I speak with him quite a lot because he gets to sit down with the Prime Minister sometimes, and I get some information from that. And that's why, in some ways, I admire the stamina of Netanyahu, who's just on the go nonstop, almost 16 hours a day, pretty much 6 days a week. And he does calm it down a little bit on Friday night and Saturday, but extraordinary. But with regard to the 600,000, firstly, it's to be clear, to keep it simple, because it's not clear in my head. There are no proxy votes. There are no postal votes. However, there are votes for those people who work for the foreign ministry, who work outside of Israel. So in other words, they've been posted, for example, in London, the ambassador, Sipi Hotoveli, and her people, head of media, etc., Ohad Semet, and one or two other people, they get to vote. They would have started it already. Actually, I think they voted last week, or some of them have started voting this week. And that happens in embassies across the world. Those votes then eventually get to Israel. The same can be said for emergency workers in the hospital. They also get to vote sometimes in voting booths. It was a question that was recently asked. Somebody is in hospital visiting somebody, they have to be with their mother all day long. Can they vote in the hospital? The answer is no, because you're not in the hospital bed. And there are certain workers like that. The IDF soldiers have begun voting. They started voting yesterday. So there was a question mark as to, in the last election, whether there was 200 or 300,000 votes, whether they all actually got to the place that they should have got to and were counted. And I was told, I wasn't aware of this, and I'm not clued up on this subject, but I was told by this person that perhaps not all of them were counted last time. And as a result, somebody, one of the members of Knesset, who lost his place as a result, I think it was on the Likud list, lost, in other words, there was 36 seats last time, and he claims it, it could have been 37 seats, so he's taken it to the Supreme. So the answer still hasn't come. This time, I'm told it's twice as many votes. So in other words, they're looking at maybe 600,000 that might be voting outside. So it's a tough one. And I have to tell you, since he told me that in the last 24 hours, I've been thinking about that quite a lot to try and get my head around that. That's why I asked Rachel if you had seen my tweet asking that question to get more information about that.
She's saying no, but if we do have another session with you after the election to talk about the result of the election, we can come back to that again. So I'm looking at Ian to see if Ian has got a question he'd like to ask you. Can you nod, Ian, if you've got one? Okay, Nina, could you unmute him? Ian Wise?
Most famous question.
Maybe I can do it. Maybe I can do it.
I've done
it.
Okay.
Okay, Ian.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
I've been called sir for 40 years. Anyway, since I've been in Israel, that means. May I just compliment you on your exceptional knowledge and understanding of the situation here. It was really, really good. But I want to tell you, hearing it in English was really depressing. In Hebrew, it's a part of the everyday life we have here, and so it's normal, but hearing it in English was totally different for me. It made me think of coming back to Glasgow. It was so depressing. Our election system and the complications we have here. But anyway, for me as an Israeli, well, I call myself now an Israeli or an expat living in Israel, it's very difficult for someone like myself and many of my friends either to decide for whom to vote. Voting definitely will not be for Bibi. That is for sure. It's about time this man leaves the government and goes to his correct place in a 4x4 cell. The guy is totally corrupt, which I didn't think you gave enough emphasis to. He is, nothing he says is really true. He lies quite considerably. Everything he says has to be taken with a pinch of salt. He changes things. He doesn't allow anybody in his government to speak. He's the only one. Everything goes through him. He is the mouthpiece. And he's very, I don't say anti-democratic, but he's very self-centered. He treats the country like a monarchy. He sees himself and his wife as king and queen, the new Melech Shaul, the new King Saul, or King Solomon. He has, I would have liked you to give more emphasis to the crime minister, as he's called here, the anti-Bibi demonstrations we have here. The guy now has, the guy's been a politician and a prime minister for the past 20 years, living, let's say, on a politician's salary. But the guy's got about 4 or 5 houses, you know, in Israel. And I think he actually owns the one of the houses in Fifth Avenue that belong to the Israeli government, but it's in his name. He made a fortune, and I'm talking about millions of dollars, in the submarine saga, where his uncle is a supplier to Thyssen, who built the submarines, and he bought shares or was given shares at a ridiculous price and sold them for 400% profits.
Ian, can I just interrupt for a minute? Because
Am I being too anti-Bibi?
No. I'm going to say James has deliberately not spoken about any individual politician because he doesn't necessarily want to put his own point of view forward. He just wants to give us information. And I haven't asked him to do that. So what I was really hoping that you would say was not so much about why you don't like Bibi, which I now have a good understanding of, but just in general about the voting system and how you see it working out in what obviously is a democratic country. So I don't really want to talk about specifically about individual politicians.
Okay, but one thing, I'll talk about the system, what I know it as, but I would like to hear what James really thinks about cooperating with Dvir, who is...
With what, sorry?
I'd like to hear what James' views on, what's his name, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a totally ultra-right-wing, I would say fascist, but he's very close to it. He's from the Kahana regime of the past, and Bibi has gone to him after he was excluded from the previous elections by the High Court. I think I'm correct. And Bibi has taken him under his wing in order to get one more mandate. But before, if you wanted me to say something about the election,
shall I jump in and just address some of these points very briefly, Sammy?
Yeah, sure, of course, James.
Okay, so I'd like to, I just made a couple of notes. Let me see if I can address some of them as well in order, and I'll try and be very brief. With regard to, firstly, thank you for your compliments right at the beginning. And you say that maybe I didn't simplify it at the beginning. I got too technical with it, but you say it comes across much nicer in English as opposed to Hebrew. Just to be clear, I'm monitoring, I am here in the UK right now. Didn't manage to get my flight today for complications. I don't know if you were here with us at the beginning, just with regard to the second vaccination. But nevertheless, I'm monitoring the evening news networks. They come on at 8 p.m. in Israel, at 6 p.m. in the UK every single evening. Channel 12, Channel 13, Khan in Channel 11, as you're familiar with, listening to Khan Radio, the public broadcaster, all day long, getting analysis specifically from Israel, speaking directly to the top politicians and to, rather actually the top journalists, and being in Zoom calls with the politicians. In fact, tonight, I was invited along to sit in with a Benny Gantz Zoom, but of course, Glasgow Friends of Israel had priority on that. A couple of nights ago, it was Naftali Bennett, and actually last week, at the end of last week, it was actually the Prime Minister. With regard to your vote, I think that I can help you with that. The Kud party, led by Netanyahu, no, I'm only joking. So you've made it very clear how you feel about that. That's fine. And I'll come on to those points very briefly. And I've said this a few times before, 39 political parties running. It's very simple to do, and I've done this many times. I've gone in 20%, at least 20% of people on Tuesday will walk into that voting booth and they will still not be clear as to who they're going to be voting for. They'll see the slips in front of them on the tray. And if you have an interest in Israeli politics, you will know what the code is, what the Hebrew letter is for most, well, not most, but maybe some of them. So for example, I know off the top of my head, Emet is Labour, Machal is Likud, Shas is Shas, Gimel is Yahadut Torah, United Torah Judaism, Bet is Naftali Bennett. And I can keep going on. To save the time over here, you have to identify whether you're from the right, the left, or the religious. There's two main strictly Orthodox parties. Let's assume that you're not going to be voting for Shas or United Torah Judaism. That leaves the left-wing side. That means Yesh Atid, that means Labour, Meretz, or Blue and White. So we've narrowed it down. 39 parties, now just down to 4. That's not bad. If you're on the right, you've got the Likud. I think you've safely ruled them out. Or you've got Naftali Bennett, Yamina. You've got Gidon Saar. That's his New Hope party, a breakaway, of course, as you know, from the Likud party. And then the other party, Religious Zionist, on the right, led by Betzalel Smotrich. You touched upon his alignment with the Otzma Yehudit party, the far right party. Itamar Ben Gvir is his name, far right. They look like they're going to pass the election, but nevertheless, I always say, and by the way, there are left-wing members of Knesset that also say these words of what I'm about to say. If you allow the Ballard Party, the radical anti-Israel party from the joint lists to run in the Israeli connection, then you should be allowed to allow a far right-wing party like Otzma Yehudit, because that's democracy. If the people vote for them, then it's representative of some of the people. I don't necessarily agree with it, and most people don't, but you cannot say the Ballard Party should run, but Itamar Ben Gvir should not run. If you say Ballard can't run, and the number 7 on the Labour list, who is an Arab, who refuses to stand for the sirens when they go after Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day, and has said actually said the city of Zikron Yaakov should be completely destroyed, although she has, in fairness to her, she has apologized since that time. But if you allow her to remain on the Labour list at number 7, then again, you have to be consistent. And I say this not to you directly, Ian, but to everyone, that you have to be consistent with your views. And just finally, with regard to Bibi, I say, you think that he is a criminal, he's the worst criminal in the world, he's embezzled money, etc., etc. Maybe you're right, or maybe you're wrong. And I say maybe you're wrong because I don't know. Maybe you're right, I don't know. You know who knows? The court will know when it finally goes to court. And I think that it is right in Israel, like in any other democratic country, that if you have the evidence against a leader or against, let's talk about Netanyahu, then stop talking about it, not to you, Ian, to anyone, but to the country. Gather the evidence, which in this case the police have, give it to the Attorney General, and if there's a case, then you take him to court. Now, there's 3 indictments against him. You mentioned one, the submarine case. The Attorney General said there is nothing to answer for on that. There is no evidence that Netanyahu did anything wrong. So that case has been dropped. That was known as Case 3000. It's not part of the indictment against Netanyahu. The other 3, receiving gifts, receiving favorable coverage, and a more complicated one related to the Walla news site, and related as well when he was Minister of Communications with the Telephone Bezic site as well. We're not going to go into that, but it's for a court to hear the evidence and then convict him in 2 or 3 years' time, or say he shouldn't. And if I can just end on this point, which it suddenly occurred to me about an hour ago, and I just suddenly thought about it. Many years ago, well, not so long ago, but about 20 years ago, when Meretz was 3 political parties. See if I remember them. The old Shinui party, Rutz, and one other party, it's just escaped me right now. And they joined together to form Meretz. It was led by somebody called Shulamit Aloni, far left person. She hated religion. She hated so much about what the Jewish state stood for. She got 12 seats in the 1992 election. Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996, and he lost in 1999 to Ehud Barak. In 2000, 2001, 2002, they were talking about Netanyahu non-stop on the news, how corrupt he was, how he was full of bribery, you couldn't trust him, he's a liar. It was going on every single night on the old Channel 2, which is now Channel 12. It drove people nuts. Shulamit Aloni was one night being interviewed, and she said these words, "I'm sick and tired of hearing this. It's been going on for 2 or 3 years. The man lost the election in 1999. If you have evidence against him, then take him to court and let a court decide. If you don't, then stop talking about him." And I think it's another problem in Israeli society today. He's tried, not him, but there's also somebody else in the Israeli press right now who's being accused. He's not in the, if you watch the Hebrew news at night, he's not a politician, but he's a well-known person. He's being accused of sexual crimes. There is evidence against him. He will go to court. He's been named. That's fine. What I don't like is, and I've been watching this in the last few nights and listening to it on the radio, the journalists are talking about it non-stop, and people are coming, he's terrible, he's a crook, and he's a sexual beast, and he's been doing it for 20. You can't trial somebody on the radio, on the television. We don't have that in the UK. The UK, if you have an indictment against somebody, that's it. You're not allowed to talk about the case because it can prejudice the case and the case can be thrown out. I think that law should be brought into Israel. Let's see what happens with Netanyahu. Let's see the trial. It will take 2 or 3 years and see where we are right now. That's my view on that. So I hope I helped you with regard to choosing a political party. If you're on the right, you choose one of the rights. If you're on the left, choose on the left. If you're religious, which perhaps you're not, but I might be wrong, then you would choose a religious party.
Thanks. Thank you, James. I just wanted to finish by saying that no matter how much you criticize Israel, and people do criticize Israel, at least it has a recognized democratic system and a recognized judicial system. And regardless of what we feel about Netanyahu, eventually he will be brought before the courts. So we actually had a member of the Scottish Parliament on this call earlier on tonight, but I've just noticed he's left. So I'm going to try and ask him. His name is Maurice Corey. He's a Conservative member of Parliament in Edinburgh. I'm going to try and ask him what he thought about your presentation tonight at some point, and I will let you know.
Sammy, just very briefly, I'm so sorry to interrupt you because I can't see you as you're speaking because I moved on to some other faces. However, I remember sitting next to him at the 2018 Glasgow Friends Conference. He gave me his business card. He said, "James, please email me. I want to talk to you." I emailed him 2 or 3 times. I never heard from him.
Well, try it again because he was on the Zoom tonight, so he'll recognize your name. So I would suggest you do.
I've lost. Yeah, I've
okay,
lost.
I will contact him and copy you. Anyway, listen, I'd really just like to thank you very much. Yes.
Just one small point. You asked me about the election system.
You have to be quick because we're running a bit late. Ian.
Okay, very, very quickly. Opinion, and as someone who's now lives with the system, what you call the PR system here in Israel for a fair number of years, the British system of having someone representing you is so much better because you have an address and someone to go to. When I choose whoever I'm going to choose, I still don't know who is my person. I can't pick up a phone or go to meet him in a weekly meeting or anything because I don't have anybody to go to. And the problem with that, our politicians have become an elite who are served by the people instead of the people serving them.
The other way around.
The other way around, yes.
Did I say it the other way around?
Yeah.
I did it from left to right, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I think James made that point earlier on that there should be people that are identified and recognized.
Oh, totally.
Okay, all right. So thanks for that contribution, Ian. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming on our meeting tonight and listening to James's wonderful expertise.
Thank you so much.
And we will keep in touch with James, and if there is a desire to have another session with James after the election for him to explain what actually happened and how it happened, I'm sure we'll be able to set that up. So thank you very much, James. And on behalf of everybody else, I hope you enjoy what's left of the election campaign. and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye, James. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean and everyone. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.